Welcome back. So we are now in the second lecture for chapter 13. And now we're looking at the larynx. So the larynx, also known as your voice box, has more than one major function. So it has the function of sending air from the pharynx into the trachea, but it also functions in making noises. So when you look at if you look at the superior aspect of the trachea, you look down into the trachea. You can see the epiglottis up here. You can see the epiglottis there. And then you see these vocal folds. So as air moves by them, those vocal folds will start to vibrate. And that actually produces sound. So the type of vibration is going to determine the pitch of the sound and the loudness of the sound. Nope, there we go. The epiglottis is the superior portion of the larynx. It is a tiny spoon-like flap of elastic cartilage, and its function is to cover the larynx when food or drink enters the pharynx. So it basically, food goes down and it's going to get pushed shut. And then the epiglottis will open back up after the food is gone or the drink is gone. So vocal folds are the structures that actually cause air to, or cause, not air, but cause sound. They vibrate when air moves past them, allowing the sound that we produce. So any inflammatory response to the larynx, epiglottis, the vocal cords, that's known as laryngitis, and that's when you can't speak very well, which happens more often than I would like, which sucks because part of my job is to speak well so that I can explain materials to you guys. So it's kind of fun when I have laryngitis. So here again is the larynx right here. This is the laryngopharynx. There's your epiglottis. So as materials come through, the epiglottis is going to cover the opening into the larynx. And that will keep materials from entering the wrong tube. And then food can go right down through the esophagus and into the stomach. The trachea then is known as our windpipe, and it is a tube that leads from the larynx and leads to the bronchi, both the right and left bronchi. The trachea has ciliated cells. Of course, it's got a mucous membrane. This whole structure has a mucous membrane, but the ciliated cells help to beat materials in the opposite direction of air. So as we breathe in, mucus traps potential dust or pathogens, and then the cilia beats that mucus towards our throat so we can either spit or we can swallow that material down and get rid of it. And it won't get into our lungs. So this is what the trachea looks like. So this is a transverse cut of the trachea. We're looking superiorly at the trachea then. The anterior aspect, we have the C-shaped cartilage that surrounds the anterior and both the sides of the trachea. Posteriorly, we do not have any cartilage. This is because behind the trachea is the esophagus. And as food and drink moves into the esophagus, sometimes it has to expand into the trachea to allow a larger bolus to move down into the stomach. So we have no cartilage on this aspect so that the esophagus can do its job. But we can never eat and drink no, no, that's not true. We can never eat and breathe at the same time. So like swallowing and breathing don't function together. So eating and breathing, chewing and breathing work fine, I guess. But then the trachea branches off into two bronchi. Each bronchus then enters a lung, and the bronchus, once it enters the lung, it divides into smaller and smaller branches. And we typically think of the bronchi as a tree because it keeps branching off into smaller and smaller regions. And then these branches move to all regions of the lungs and allow for gas exchange at all the tiny little cells called alveoli. And so here you can see the right and left main bronchus moving into each lung. And notice that the right lung has 3 lobes, the left lung has 2 lobes. So the main bronchus moves in and then branches off into each of the lobes in both cases. And then those lobar bronchi branch off into smaller and smaller sections. So the lungs themselves occupy almost the entire thoracic cavity. The only other structure that has a large amount of real estate in the thoracic cavity is the heart. All other structures have or take up very minimal amounts of space. The lungs rest on the diaphragm. And so the base of the lungs rests on the diaphragm. And when the diaphragm then contracts, the lungs are able to expand and get larger. Surrounding each lung is a serous membrane. In this case, it's called the pleural membrane. If you remember that from the beginning of this class, we talked about the different membranes. The pleural membrane covers the lungs and covers the thoracic cavity. And then there's pleural fluid found within that decreases friction while we breathe. So we constantly have movement of our lungs, but we don't have pain or friction on our lungs because of that pleural cavity. And here you can see the lungs, and here's the cavity, the thoracic cavity. We have a parietal pleura running along the cavity, and then we have a visceral pleura running along the organ or the lungs in this case. And in between is that pleural fluid. And this is just a transverse section of our lungs. You can again see the same structures. You can also see the heart here. So I like this picture. I found it actually on Pinterest, but it shows a beautiful bronchial tree. So here we have the trachea. Then the trachea branch off into 2 primary bronchi. The primary bronchi then branch off into either 2 or 3 lobar bronchi, and then those branch off further into all the tiny segments and will end up at the different alveoli. And so it's known as a bronchial tree because the subdivisions get smaller and smaller and smaller until we reach the smallest passageways that conduct air into the alveoli. And so here are the terminal bronchioles. Terminal bronchioles lead into these respiratory bronchioles and the alveoli then. So these are little alveolar ducts. The respiratory zone includes the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, the alveolar sacs, and the alveolar sacs are the site where gas exchange actually occurs. So only at those sacs do we actually have gas exchange. And so here's another picture of alveoli. So it looks kind of like a bunch of grapes put together, not, of course, the color of grapes, but when we open them up, you can see the little passageways for air and the passageways allow for gas exchange. And so attached very closely to these alveoli are pulmonary capillaries, which allow for gas exchange with the blood. So at this point, you should be able to tell me the functions of the larynx, the functions of the trachea, why cartilage does not extend to the posterior aspect of the trachea, what the function of bronchi are, what the bronchial tree is, what the function of the lungs are, which lung has 2 lobes and which lung has 3 lobes, what are the serous membranes that surround the lungs, what are alveoli, and what are alveoli composed of. I'm going to stop here. It's been a 10-minute video, and I'll start the next video in a little while. Have a great day. Bye.